a.m. Good morning, everyone. It's 9 a.m. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a lot to get to this morning. I'm Dr. Mark Miller, and I am happy that you are all joining us this morning for this morning's conference on decriminalizing nature. I want to welcome those who are attending, especially those who are our elected legislators in Virginia's General Assembly. I believe you will find this conference informative, and will give you a great deal of information of the importance of decriminalizing nature. As far as a quick background on me, my doctorate is in clinical psychology, and I am licensed as a professional counselor and certified as a substance abuse counselor. I'm a member of the Association of Entheogenic Practitioners and co-founder of Decriminalizing Nature, Virginia. I was born here in Virginia at Fort Lee while my father was serving in the Army. I have lived here in Virginia for the past 24 years, and I am proud, so proud, to call Virginia my home. There was a great deal of work that went into organizing this conference, and I want to take a moment to appreciate those individuals. First, I want to thank what I have come to call the team. These folks include Paul Brassler, Melissa McLaughlin, Dr. Randy Frederick, Jordan Shirky, Victoria Maddox, and Nick Samuels. Their insight and assistance in the development and support of this conference cannot be overstated. I want to also thank Brandon Jackson from Delegate Adams' office and Charles Turner and June Laffey from Senator Hashmi's office for all their work, insight, patience as we coordinated this conference. It could not have been done without them. I also want to thank Carlos Plazola and Dr. Larry Norris from Decriminalize Nature National for their assistance in the organization of this conference and who you will be hearing from later this morning. I especially want to appreciate Will Nelson, who you will also be hearing from this morning. He is the other co-founder of Decriminalize Nature Virginia and was the co-organizer of this conference. He must be given a great deal of credit for suggesting who should be presenting this morning. Thank you to all who is presenting this morning. It has been an incredible, distinct honor to connect with all of you while coordinating this conference. I am humbled to be here with all of you this morning. Your expertise and insights are second to none, and thank you for being part of all this important work. I also want to appreciate Dr. Tom Pinkston, who's been a very big teacher in my life when it comes to plant medicines and my own personal healing. I can't imagine where I would be if it wasn't for his guidance and his insights. Finally, I also want to thank my wife of 31 years, Jennifer, for her support and flexibility over the past 3 months. Her love and patience cannot be measured, especially when it came to sharing me with all of you. I am so grateful to have her as a partner and a friend. I couldn't be more blessed. As for the background of this conference, I approached Delegate Adams, Don Adams, and Senator Ghazala Hashmi over the summer to discuss the applications of plant medicines regarding psychological healing for post-traumatic stress disorder in our veterans, the treatment of anxiety and depression and addiction and traumatic brain injury, end-of-life palliative care. Both Delegate Adams and Senator Hashmi took time to meet with individuals who have benefited from these plant medicines and became convinced, as I hope you will too if you are not already, that decriminalization of plants will go a long, long way in psychological healing and emotional growth. We are so incredibly lucky to have two such powerful, courageous women serving in our General Assembly, and I am so proud to have them representing me as my senator and delegate. Senator Hashmi must be given full credit for the idea to organize this conference. As you will soon see when the folks are educated, that what ultimately happens is their opinions change, their concerns quickly fall away when it comes to working with these plant medicines. This conference is organized into 4 parts. The first part will focus on offering just the data, what has been found from respected peer-reviewed research conducted for more than over 10 years. The second part will focus on how these plant medicines can help our veterans. The third part will focus on how these plant medicines can help with other mental health challenges. And finally, the fourth part will focus on decriminalization efforts nationwide and here in Virginia. Please note, and I want to make this very, very clear, these plant medicines work in concert with other treatment modalities. They are but one tool in the toolbox towards psychological healing that includes counseling, the support of friends, family, the community, and the medical community. Plant medicines are a very, very important tool in that toolbox. And it is way overdue that folks, the individual and the treatment provider, be allowed to choose what works best. So with those thoughts in mind, it is a great honor and respect that I have the good fortune to pass the baton over to my state senator, Ghazala Hashmi, who will offer her thoughts about decriminalization of plant medicines and more about this morning's conference. Senator Hashmi.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Mark, for that introduction, and thank you for your opening comments. I think you've done an excellent job of laying out the purpose and the scope of this conference, and I want to thank everybody who has joined us, taking time to participate, listen, and learn. And I know, Mark, you thanked a lot of people already, but one person remains to be thanked, and that is you. You have been the guiding light for organizing this conference, and I know you've done an extraordinary job and put in a tremendous amount of effort. So we all certainly thank you for taking on that role. I want to thank especially my fellow legislators who are joining, or members of their staff who are joining. This is part of the purpose of the conference, is to share what I have learned, and I think what Delegate Adams has already known and has been interested in, and that is the part or the role that plant-based medicines can play in helping people through therapeutic means, helping them regain their purpose in life, and to address issues and concerns that affect so many people in our community. One thing that has intrigued me in the process of learning myself is the kind of tremendous research that is available that demonstrates that these particular plant-based medicines have the capacity to heal, to help and assist people in ways that other medicines often cannot do. We have a panel of esteemed physicians, as well as individuals who have been working long in this particular area. Their research, their insights this morning are going to be invaluable. So I'm looking forward to learning. Kind of as a side note, I'll share my interest in plant-based medicine actually comes out of literature. When I was in graduate school, and this was over 30 years ago, I was taking a class in medieval English writing, British writing. And time and time again in the literature, there were so many references to the healing products that were coming from the plants and the medicinal properties of those plants. And there was extensive discussion in literature about these medicines. And so one of my graduate papers was focused on what that means and how the plant-based medicines are represented in medieval British writing. So I've long been interested in this topic, and I appreciate Dr. Miller for reintroducing myself to this issue and concern, and I'm looking forward to listening and learning more today. So it's my honor to introduce my delegate, Delegate Adams. She is a strong voice and champion of health and education in our General Assembly. And I know she's been a very wonderful colleague for me to work with on this particular piece of legislation. So here's Delegate Adams.
Thank you, Senator. And thank you all. Thanks, Mark, so much for coordinating this. And, you know, I just reiterate all of the praise to the people that coordinated this. And I'm grateful for those who are in attendance and who are contributing to this as panelists. I won't take up too much time. I think there's been a lot said. I feel very passionate about avenues to support people as we sort of embark on an epidemic of depression and general ill ease in the world. I think that I've spent a lot of time studying plant medicine, particularly psilocybin. I just think it offers unique and extraordinary paths to help people out of things like fear at the end of life, and refractory depression and PTSD. I think it is time for these types of treatments to be available. And I'm really looking forward to learning more from our panelists. And to that end, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Matthew, Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health Services at Johns Hopkins, Matthew Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Delegate Adams. So yeah, my name is Matt Johnson. I am a full professor at Johns Hopkins in the psychiatry department. I've been conducting research with psychedelics, primarily psilocybin, for the last 17 years, and have focused on the good, the bad, the ugly, the known risks associated with the drug, what the basic effects in the human being are, and I've examined several therapeutic potential effects of psilocybin. So I'm going to go over some of that work with you and tell you a little bit of what I think in terms of broad strokes are the major points about the public health science of psilocybin, what we know about it. But before going further, definitely want to thank Dr. Miller for putting on this meeting, and especially want to thank Senator Hashmi and Delegate Adams for exploring this really important topic. And I'll add that I'm at Johns Hopkins in Maryland a long time, but I have deep roots in Virginia. It's where I spent my childhood and formative high school years, and it's where my core family members are that I visit regularly. So it's an honor to present this for you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's see. So hopefully you're seeing something that looks like a PowerPoint screen that says public health science of psilocybin. If not, someone please yell at me. But psilocybin is now known to occur in to exist in over 200 species of mushrooms, mostly in the psilocybe genus of mushrooms, referred to colloquially as so-called magic mushrooms. Psilocybin acts in the brain at a subtype of serotonin receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor. And in terms of pharmacology, that puts it in the same class as the other so-called classic psychedelics, LSD, mescaline, and dimethyltryptamine, which you may have heard of as active compound in ayahuasca. There's other drugs that are often or sometimes called psychedelics, such as MDMA or PCP, ketamine. Those aren't classic psychedelics, though. So much of what I'm going to say about psilocybin is largely going to extend to the other classic psychedelics, but much is also not likely to extend to those other compounds, which are in a different category. So from a broad perspective, it's important to know that trials have been conducted at a number of universities, and the number of them growing over the last couple of decades. Our group at Johns Hopkins, New York University, UCLA, University of California, San Francisco, others. Psilocybin has been designated as breakthrough therapy status for not one, but for two separate entities, USONA Institute and Compass Pathways, that are moving psilocybin through FDA regulatory trials in phase 2B right now, and going to be moving into phase 3. And this can put it within reach of a clinical approval, FDA approval outside of research with only a few years, of course, depending on those phase 3 results for safety and efficacy. And it's important to note how just like special that status is. Breakthrough status really represent a determination from the FDA that early data on a medication are showing such substantial progress for a disorder for which there are severe limitations in its treatment. So in this case, the breakthrough therapy status that has been designated for psilocybin is in the treatment of depression. And that designation has, at the time, was largely based on the work that my colleagues and I did with reductions in depression and cancer patients. And I'll show you a little bit of that work. So other preliminary positive scientific results for psilocybin in treating disorders include cancer-related anxiety and depression, tobacco addiction, alcoholism, and demoralization in long-term AIDS survivors. A little bit about the cancer work. And again, this is broad strokes, so very quickly, this is the largest study that's ever been conducted with a psychedelic, or particularly with, and certainly with psilocybin, for the treatment of cancer-related distress. This was 51 patients, all had a life-threatening cancer involving either depression, anxiety, or both. Here are our major outcomes from the study. And I'll say everyone in the study really only got just one administration of a high dose of psilocybin. They received a second dose of psilocybin that was really meant to serve as a low dose, as a placebo, a really trivial dose. And so what we found was people came in at severe levels of depression. I know you're not familiar with these scales, but you can see on the left on baseline of both depression and anxiety, it's the Hamilton Anxiety and Depression Inventories. People came in at clinically severe levels at baseline. And then 5 weeks after their first psilocybin sessions, the red group, those are the folks that got the real deal high dose psilocybin 5 weeks beforehand. You see a plummeting of their depression into the normal range of the scale, where people on average are not going to be diagnosed with any disorder. This is the normal range. That's pretty remarkable. Post 2 on the graph of the both on the axis of both graphs, that refers to 5 weeks after the second psilocybin session. So now both groups have had the real deal high dose session. And I'll say individuals were randomized to either receive the high dose first or the low dose first, and then they were crossed over to receive which other condition. So everyone served as their own control, so to speak. So, but now at post 2, now that blue group that got the low dose first, now they've received the high dose, and then their levels of suffering are at those very low levels as seen in the initial group. So it doesn't matter whether you got it 5 weeks ago or 10 weeks ago. And then that's astonishing enough. It's really a breakthrough, I would say, in psychiatry to see reductions in depression 6 months later. Nothing has come close to that. Ketamine has been considered a breakthrough medical treatment for depression because with antidepressant effects that are immediate and last about a week, which is a legitimate breakthrough. But compared to these data, this obviously dwarfs those data, so we need to seriously follow up on those results. We've also done work, and we published it with major depression. This is outside of cancer, so people with major depressive disorder. We published the first randomized study of this. I'm showing you results here from JAMA Psychiatry from 2020. Very similar to the cancer work. People came in at high levels of depression at baseline, and then after their first session, which I'm showing you in the immediate treatment group on the graph here, drastic reductions into the normal end of the scale. And then the randomized comparison group in this case, which were randomized to essentially not get the treatment and wait to get the treatment, you saw no change there. And then what I'm not showing you here is that after those individuals that were randomized to get the treatment in a delayed fashion, after they received the treatment, their reductions in depression were about as large as the initial group. And then this therapeutic indication of using it to help people with an addiction, largely based on the older literature with LSD and treating alcoholism. I took a stab starting 13 years ago, seeing if I could use psilocybin to treat tobacco addiction. The first trial was really promising. It was only 15 people, but we got a success rate, biologically verified abstinence at 80% of participants at 6 months. And so you have to be limited in your conclusions from a non-randomized pilot study. The real question is whether this is worthy of follow-up, but the results were, the absence rates were so high, it was clearly worthy of follow-up. I'm showing you those here on psilocybin plus CBT, that's cognitive behavioral therapy. That's sort of the talk therapy that we use to help people quit smoking, done in conjunction with the psilocybin treatment. And you can see that those abstinence rates, and this is continuous abstinence. This is what I'm showing you here. This is the most stringent conservative measure, meaning you haven't had a single cigarette, biologically confirmed through urine testing, breath testing, and self-report. In this case, 12 months later, over 50% of the sample are abstinent. And that dwarfs the best medications that are FDA approved, such as Chantix, which is varenicline, and the others that I'm showing you, or talk therapy by itself. So now we're in the midst of a 100-person randomized trial helping people quit smoking. Very similar to the initial, we'll randomize people to one psilocybin session or nicotine patch treatment using the standard FDA label of nicotine patch treatment. It's in process, but most of the participants have gotten to their 1-year follow-up. So 61 out of the 100 have. And right now, where it stands, the snapshot of the data, 59% of participants in that psilocybin group 1 year after the target quit date are biologically confirmed as abstinent, compared to 28% for patch, which is very good actually for patch, but nonetheless being swamped by what we're seeing with psilocybin. And recently, as of within the last month, it's made some news, but I received, along with my colleagues, the first grant by the US federal government in over 50 years to study specifically the therapeutic treatment potential of a classic psychedelic such as psilocybin. So we're going to be continuing that work in a multi-site trial with other sites at University of Alabama, Birmingham, and New York University. So that's about a $4 million grant. So we're super excited to move forward with that work. Some major points here to make, big picture regarding the therapeutic potential of psilocybin. Research uses safeguards, that address all of the known risks and reduce them to an acceptable level. So via screening, preparation, monitoring, and follow-up care. And I've made it a point in my career to focus on the dark side of these compounds. This is a major review paper I published in 2008. And here's what we know very quickly about the risks. In certain people, and we're talking about 1 or 2% of the population, it appears through clinical observation that these drugs can destabilize people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or a predisposition for those disorders. It's sometimes kind of overstated as such, someone went on a trip and never came back, which is an overstatement. Of course, the drug is metabolized. But for people dealing with schizophrenia or have an identifiable predisposition, it really appears that a very strong, intense experience with the psychedelic can serve that same role as a traumatic life event for those individuals in destabilizing them. So thankfully, those individuals are readily screened out of this type of treatment, and it represents a small portion, but real portion of the population. For anyone receiving psilocybin at a high enough dose, they can have a bad trip, even under ideal circumstances that we provide at the highest dose that we've given. About a third of the people will say some substantial anxiety and fear popped up, which is well managed in our setting. Occasionally out there in the wild, and it is very rare, but it does happen. People can panic and end up having some harm to themselves or to others because of that panic in an unsafe situation. The same way with other highly intoxicating substances in public, such as alcohol, you see all the time. That's going to happen, at least to some degree. Sometimes it causes, psilocybin causes moderate increases in pulse and blood pressure, causing a risk for those with very severe heart disease. So we only screen out people at very high levels. People on controlled hypertension, they're okay. I'm talking about very severe. For example, one of the very few people in the medical literature to have died after psilocybin mushrooms is someone who was a heart transplant patient. So not a good idea. Anything that can increase your pulse and blood pressure a little bit, such as going up the stairs, flights of stairs, that sends people to the ER, all the time for that very vulnerable. So it's sort of in that category. So people at the most extreme form of heart disease. It also causes a headache on average the day following the 24 hours following its use. Psilocybin does, typically in the mild to moderate range, nothing to be that would prevent its clinical use. We also think, and following up and working with colleagues at Yale, they're pursuing psilocybin as a therapeutic to treat certain types of headaches, migraines, and cluster headaches. So the fact that people are initially getting headaches in the 24 hours after use might be a clue into eventually figuring out the mechanisms for potential headache treatment. So, but nonetheless, a risk to be aware of. And one category of harm I want to mention that's not there for psilocybin, but that is typically there for all other classes of abused drugs, are that it can be used, it can certainly be abused. And by that, it can, I mean, any type of use that can harm the self or other people. So easy example is driving on the substance. But psilocybin and the other classic psychedelics don't lead to addiction. And by that, I mean compulsive drug seeking. No one is sort of jonesing for their next psilocybin fix or LSD fix. And we know this through the very solid data on the way it works, or rather doesn't work, in the brain's mesolimbic reward system, on large scale epidemiology, on very reliable animal models of addiction with self-administration. So we know that very solidly. So that's really nice to know for a drug that's being developed as a therapeutic, that it really stands in contrast to many other classes of drugs that are used therapeutically, that do have accepted medical use, that have in fact higher addiction potential, such as opioids and amphetamines and sedatives such as Ambien, et cetera. Also published this paper in 2018, which is really paving the way for asking the question, if psilocybin is eventually, if it looks good in phase 3 trials and is approved as a medication, what should its scheduling look like? Now, this is from the FDA federal level pathway, with under the guise of the Controlled Substances Act, with that framework as a given. And it conducted an exhaustive review over the last half century of everything that's known relevant about psilocybin, concluded based on the known harms and their magnitude and their nature, that if psilocybin is approved as medicine, evidence suggests it should be placed no more restrictively than Schedule 4. So really not even, in Schedule 2, where methamphetamine and cocaine are at, or even in Schedule 3, where some other drugs with addiction potential are. For example, some of the sedative drugs, the sleeping drugs, anti-anxiety drugs. But that was our major conclusion. And based on a number of reviews that have looked at the relative dangers of psilocybin compared to other drugs, and I'll say something about that. Compared to, and I should say very importantly, compared to both legal and illegal drugs, psilocybin looks extremely favorable. It has its risks, everything does, but relatively speaking, for example, here, this work by Robert Gable in 1993 in this review paper, he estimated psilocybin ranked the lowest of all of the studied drugs in terms of risk of fatality. It's virtually impossible unless you're at severe risk, like a heart transplant patient. There's no known lethal overdose in the human being. So it's ranked as the lowest in risk of fatality, but also ranked lowest in the risk of dependence. So that's why you see it on the figure here in the bottom left-hand quadrant of that 2x2 factorial. Some work that's been done in the United Kingdom, where a group of drug experts got together and rated the harms to self and to others across a variety of drugs, legal and illegal. And you can see alcohol tops the list, and at the very, very bottom of that list, psilocybin mushrooms. Well, you may not trust the experts in the UK, maybe some reason you don't trust the Brits. Well, we can ask the folks across the Netherlands, somewhere else in Europe, and we find again that psilocybin was ranked the lowest, both in terms of individual harm and harm to others, or population level harm. And if you don't trust the British or the Dutch, you can ask across the European Union. Similar data for experts, drug experts across the European Union, same answer. Psilocybin mushrooms came in dead last in those harm categories. And maybe you don't trust the experts at all. Maybe you want to know, what do the drug users say about this? Well, very similar work. Asked the same questions and got assessments from a variety of drug users with experience with different varieties of drugs, and their rankings of drug harms showed extremely strong correspondence with scientific and medical expert rankings. So correlations of 0.9 or above for those that might be familiar with stats, but virtually identical ratings on average. And again, psilocybin mushrooms ranked the lowest as total harm caused to the individual and others. I'm showing you data here from the Drug Abuse Warning Network. This is the national system for recording emergency department visits. Yes, there is some rate of people showing up to the emergency department on psilocybin mushrooms, It's orders of magnitude lower than for other drugs such as opioids, cocaine, and alcohol. And so, a rate of per 100,000 in the population, you're talking about, 1 to 2 people out of 100,000. Also, similar data, this is from the American Association of Poison Control Centers. Again, you can see psilocybin containing mushrooms showing just orders of magnitude lower prevalence than other, calls to emergency poison hotlines compared here. I'm showing you compared to oxycodone, one of the big medical opioids, part of the opioid epidemic crisis, and ethanol. And you can see here on average that on most years for psilocybin across the nations, there's 0 deaths. Occasionally there is, typically an accident. You see 1 year in 2012 there was, but typically across the whole nation, no deaths. Conclusions, okay. Psilocybin can be abused like many other legal and illegal substances, and it leads to harm in a minority of users. The scale of harm, however, is substantially lower than for many illegal and legal substances, substantially lower. Absence of addiction potential limits its use. So even heavy users, a heavy user might use, say, once or twice a month, not typically on any daily basis. That's the typical rate for more addictive drugs of abuse. Among users, use is infrequent. Even several times a year is often considered would be heavier use amongst users. And misdemeanor and felony penalties for psychedelic use, for psilocybin use, I would certainly argue are exceedingly disproportionate compared to the harms that we're seeing to other drugs. Criminal records, I study drugs across the board, including the dark side, addiction, the commonalities of addiction across drugs. And with methamphetamine, with cocaine, with opioids, with alcohol, tobacco, you name it. And I think it's important to recognize that criminal records pose major obstacles throughout the lifespan for educational and employment opportunities. Education and employment are well established scientifically to provide protective effects against the many real and known harms associated with drugs of abuse. So, these types of penalties that can cause lifetime obstacles to the very societal functions that we know can buffer and protect people from harms of a drug of abuse. It's a self-defeating strategy in terms of public health in the long term, I would argue. And overall public health benefit is therefore increased by removing criminal penalties for psilocybin use. And that's all I had prepared for folks. And so I will now stop my screen sharing. So now it's my pleasure to introduce another panelist, Dr. Javier Gonzalez-Maceo from Virginia Commonwealth University, the Medical Center. So I hand it off to you. Thank you.
So let me put the laser. So good morning. My name is Dr. Javier Gonzalez-Maceo. I'm a professor of physiology in the Medical School College of Virginia at VCU. And first, I would like to thank Dr. Mark Miller for the invitation to talk about the use of psychedelics in the treatment of mental disorders, and also Senator Hasmi and Delegate Adams for organizing this conference about psychedelics. So as a background, my laboratory at the VCU in the Department of Physiology is interested in 2 main topics. The first one, molecular psychiatry, or in other words, mechanisms underlying psychiatric conditions, particularly schizophrenia and depression. And related to this, I'm also very much interested in the process by which psychedelics, such as psilocybin and LSD, induce these unique effects, particularly using animal models. Most of the work that we do in my laboratory is with mice, with animal models. And I need to show this formality. But what do we know about the psychiatric disorders? For example, schizophrenia and depression. So they are severe. They affect about half of the population, which is a big number along our lifetimes. About a quarter, 25% more or less of us every year has a psychiatric disorder. And the total cost of these psychiatric conditions are over this number that I'm showing here, which is a big number. And also related to the economic costs, psychiatric disorders are behind only 2 other disorders, ischemic heart disease or a heart attack, and also motor vehicle accident. And about our veterans, if we talk about our veterans, we know that close to 13%, this is the number, are diagnosed with a PTSD or a post-traumatic stress disorder. And we also know that almost 1 out of every 3 veterans with a substance use disorder also have a PTSD. So that said, why do we think that we need new medications for psychiatric conditions? And about this, we can say as an example that all the available antidepressant medications that we have in the clinic, for example, Prozac, fluoxetine, some others, they require several weeks or even months to start to get clinical effects for the beneficial effects to occur. And on top of that, there's a high percent of the patients with depression taking standard medications that are treatment resistant. Or in other words, they do not respond to antidepressant medication. So it is clear that we do need new medications to treat depression and other psychiatric conditions. And related to this, and this is the reason we are here today, psychedelics, as we heard from the previous speaker, Dr. Johnson, may represent a new pharmacological tool to treat depression. So what are psychedelics compared to other drugs, including drugs of abuse? And most importantly, is the correct classification of psychedelics as drugs of abuse correct? So I would say that, if I may so, that probably not. And I will give you some reasons as to why I think that psychedelics are not supposed to be classified as drugs of abuse. So I'm showing here 4 examples of drug classes. According to the DEA, or to the Drug Enforcement Administration, the first one, narcotics, include, for example, opiates, such as morphine and fentanyl. While the alcohol stimulants, such as amphetamine or cocaine, belong to a different class. A group called hallucinogens, this group here, and this includes, for example, ecstasy, LSD, psilocybin, or PCP. And also a 4th group, which, for example, marijuana or cannabis. The DEA classifies all these drugs among 5 groups, depending on their medical use and also on their abuse potential. But I'm showing just here 3 examples. Schedule 1 are drugs with a high potential for abuse, and according to this classification, no medical use. And this includes, for example, heroin, marijuana, and also psilocybin belongs to this, currently to this group, Schedule 1. But most of the most important surprising points about this classification is that the molecular target of in other words, the receptor of the responsible for the effects of these drugs. For example, among these narcotics, all the molecular target is similar. Is what we call the mu opioid receptor or the opioid receptor. For stimulants, the main molecular target is the dopamine transporter. And for marijuana and cannabis is what we call the cannabinoid receptor. But that is not the case for the drug that is put together here, according to the DEA, as hallucinogens. And this class includes drugs that belong to at least 3 different classes in terms of the pharmacology and the molecular target. For example, again, within this group, ecstasy interact with many molecular targets, but one of them is the serotonin transporter. Ketamine and PCP, what I'm marking here, they are blockers of a glutamine receptor, and these 2, LSD and psilocybin, that what we call, as we heard from the previous speaker, they are called classical psychedelics. They are molecularly and totally different to these 2, ecstasy and ketamine or PCP. They activate a particular serotonin receptor that is known as the serotonin 2 receptor. So once again, putting these together as part of the same class is not pharmacologically correct. Additionally, the psychedelic psilocybin is classified as a Schedule 1, which again means that this drug may have like a high potential and no medical use. However, morphine is classified as Schedule 2. And we do agree that morphine has a potential in medical use and is indeed very useful for as an analgesic or an anti-pain drug. But we also know that morphine as an opiate has a higher use potential. However, we also know that this is based on both recent clinical studies that we heard from the previous speaker, and also a number of experiments in rodents. Some of them are going to be shown by the next speaker, Dr. De La Fuente. So we know that the abuse potential for psilocybin and other classical psychedelics, such as LSD, is very, very, very low. The different question is whether psilocybin has a medical use. And the answer, and also based on findings from the previous speaker, we can say that yes, psilocybin can show like clinical use. And that means, once again, that this classification of psilocybin as a Schedule 1 is probably needs to be reevaluated. How did we find that the psilocybin may represent a new tool to treat psychiatric conditions, particularly in patients with severe depression? And the clinical work of psilocybin started mostly based on the findings by this drug that I'm showing here, ketamine. Again, pharmacologically is very different, but ketamine is what we call a dissociative Schedule 3 drug. And now we know, based on many clinical studies, that the single dose, single administration of ketamine induces a robust, rapid, and long-lasting antidepressant effect in patients with major depression. So this finding, again, with ketamine, pharmacologically different to the psychedelics, but with this ketamine, we saw for the first time the concept of rapid-acting antidepressant medication. This is important because with the classical antidepressants, again, for example, fluoxetine, we need to treat the patients for weeks or months to start to see the first clinical effects. So based on these findings, again, with ketamine, we and many others started to test in animal models and also in clinical studies if the psychedelic psilocybin behave as a fast-acting antidepressant. So what is psilocybin? So this compound that I'm showing here is a chemical found in a big number of what we call magic mushrooms. And this is one of the species, psilocybin cubensis. These magic mushrooms have been always part of our cultures, both here in the US and also in Europe and in South America. After administration of this compound, within minutes to hours, psilocybin is metabolized into this, what is called psilocin, is the active compound. And we know that this metabolite, as well as other psychedelics, such as LSD, profoundly, and again, as we heard also from the previous speaker, profoundly affect very basic processes related to perception, cognition, and sensory motor, and sensory processing. But also because, as I said before, these are still Schedule 1 drugs. During the past several years, psilocybin and other psychedelics have been the focus of much attention in drug abuse research. But now we know, and this is based on both basic research animal models and clinical studies, that psilocybin is not as addictive as other therapeutics. And actually, as comparison to what I mentioned before, psilocybin is less addictive than ketamine, but as I said, is now widely used to treat depression and PTSD and is classified as a Schedule 3, whereas psilocybin is classified as a Schedule 1. So, and not only this, I mean, we heard this from the previous speaker, this is just a summary. We also, and there are many clinical studies showing that psilocybin behaves as a fast-acting antidepressant. Dr. De La Fuente is one of my colleagues at VCU. In the next talk, he will present some additional data in patients and also in animal work from our laboratory, but these are just two representative examples. One of them from this group in London, and the second one by including Dr. Johnson, the previous speaker at Johns Hopkins, and so that one single administration, again, one single dose of psilocybin, together with psychological support, reduced depression in patients that did not respond before to typical antidepressants. And not only that, this clinical effect of a single administration of psilocybin lasted for weeks or even months. So based on this, what we know now is that, and these are some examples in both very well respected journals, for example, in Nature, and also in newspapers and TV news, that are sharing with us this impressive news, impressive findings related to the clinical effects of psilocybin, particularly, as I said, psilocybin or some related psychedelics. So with this, and what I'm showing as a summary is that the classical psychedelics were used in psychiatry before, decades ago, but they were placed in Schedule 1 in 1965, more than half a century. This classification made them virtually impossible to study clinically, but in the past 2 decades, some preclinical, or again, animal models, and also clinical studies have shown us that psychedelics are first, safe, and second, that they show efficacy for treating depression and potential PTSD and other severe psychiatric conditions. So if I may, as an advice, as a main conclusion, I think that we need a strategic approach to license and regulate the use of psilocybin as a new therapeutic drug in psychiatry. And with that, I leave it to the next speaker, Dr. Mario de la Fuente. He's a researcher at the Virginia Commonwealth University.
Thank you, Javier. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Give me just 1 second to arrange this for presenting view. Okay. Thanks, Javier, for the introduction, and thanks to Senator Hashmi, Delegate Adams, their staff, and of course, Dr. Miller for the invitation to present here today. I'm Mario de la Fuente Revenga. I'm a doctor in pharmacy and medicinal chemistry. And I've been working with different aspects of psychedelics pharmacology for almost 10 years now. And in addition to some work that I did with ayahuasca in humans early on, I've pioneered the exploration of unusual psychedelic chemicals and the development of predictor models in animals, predictor models that can inform of their psychedelic effects and therapeutic properties for psychedelics. And today, without getting too much into the intimacy of what plant medicines do at the biological level, I want to provide a glimpse on what they do and how they do it. So before we start, a disclaimer: I have received consultancy fees from Medic, and the opinions expressed here are solely my own and based on the available body of science. They do not reflect those of the company or the larger policy position of VCU Health and VCU Health System, my main employer. So much of the conversation around psychedelics and their therapeutic potential is centered on effects accessible to the psyche of the individual. However, we should not forget that into the eyes of any reasonable man or woman, there is a biological substrate that enables it. By the same token, discussions on safety are largely grounded on how these drugs interact with our biology. In other words, their pharmacology. Unlike a tomato, psilocybin mushrooms, ayahuasca, or peyote contain compounds that are pharmacologically active, but unlike those, for instance, in the antimalarial cinchona bark, influence the way the brain works. It's not exactly controversial to claim that the so-called magic mushrooms, or for that matter, psilocybin, differ significantly from the rather inert cabbage. Neither is to say that magic mushrooms don't have much in common with castor beans, the seeds that contain the lethal poison ricin. So while these comparisons probably are not very informative, they serve me well to highlight that safety is not categorical, it is a continuum. And as we will see, psychedelics are certainly not an innocuous foodstuff or dietary supplement, but neither deserve to carry the label poison that their legal status seems to impose on them. So while some might claim that it is the spirit of the plant that's responsible for psychedelic activity in the brain, us pharmacologists find that explanation utterly unsatisfactory. Just because these substances operate in the mind, it does not imply that we can exit the material world to explain their effects. Pharmacologists like us have scratched their heads trying to guess what mediates the remarkable effects of psychedelics. Now we know that they intersect with pathways of serotonin in many different ways, but what we identify as their distinct effects is mediated by a single molecular switch, the serotonin 2A receptor. This receptor lives at the surface of different cells in the brain, mostly neurons. When stimulated, it interferes with the way neurons communicate with each other, locally and distally all across the brain. And then this property snowballs into the manifestation of psychedelic characteristic effects. For instance, visual disturbances or a diminished sense of self. However, some of the most interesting properties of psychedelics emerge in the aftermath. A single exposure can produce changes in mindfulness the day after, but more importantly, can produce alleviation of severe mental health problems for a long time. We know of no other drugs in our current arsenal of pharmacotherapies for mental health capable of doing so. It is therefore not surprising that a large convergence of efforts are focused on trying to unravel what makes psychedelics so special. And going again from the microscopic to the macroscopic, we know that psychedelics strengthen neuronal communication. I observed that exposure to psychedelic drug results in the sprouting of synapses, the little protrusions that neurons use to communicate with each other. I also observed that this requires the serotonin 2A receptors, the receptor that I mentioned earlier, which circles back to psychedelics' original mechanism of action, or at least the mechanism of action that we can attribute the acute subjective effects to. It has been proposed that synaptic deficits are paradigmatic of depressive states. Thus, if we can thus the restoration of synaptic loss serves as a rescue mechanism to overcome these depressive states. Traditional antidepressants, and I'm thinking about Prozac, do this, but they do it at very slow speed and with high rates of treatment resistance. Psychedelics appear to get the job done at a single dose. Psychedelics do appear to be exceptional, but is this exceptionality exclusively human? There is no question that us Homo sapiens have attained a level of cognitive performance unparalleled in the animal kingdom, and those superior cognitive skills appear to be the realm where psychedelics operate. Yet, there's quite a lot we can learn from our fellow mammals. We and others have observed that rodents exhibit patterns of behavior that are consistent with psychedelic therapeutic effects. We cannot demonstrate that a mouse is suffering from depression or PTSD, let alone undergone a mystical experience, but we can attest to the improved ability to deal with stressful stimuli. This is what we demonstrated in our most recent manuscript. A single exposure to a psychedelic drug increased synaptic plasticity and was efficacious at improving the ability of the animal to adapt to the environment, an ability that we interpret as fundamental to navigate the way out of certain mental health conditions. I'm thinking about depression or PTSD. We don't intend to cure animals, but to demonstrate that there is a biological substrate to the way psychedelics work. Matthew Johnson touched upon this, so I'm gonna skip some of the parts related to safety, but zooming out from the individual into the larger dimension of public health, psychedelics score the lowest, both in harm to the individual or to others, light years from tobacco, alcohol, and of course opiates, which of course leads to the uncomfortable question of why are they placed in the most restrictive legal category of the Schedule 1? Hesitation to change such legal situation, might emerge from the perception that the bar is being lowered to allow harmful drugs to penetrate further in society. The fact is that if treated fairly, classic psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin could comfortably pass the test even by more conservative standards than current ones. Psychedelics carry a decades-long stigma, which is not justified on the basis of what we know today about their safety. In many years, dosing animals with different psychedelics myself, I have never had an occurrence of a mouse dying by a cause directly related to the psychedelic drug administered. As some might have appreciated, the dial of safety does not go all the way to the left in this scheme to the left of the slide. We don't know if psychedelics that psychedelics carry lesser but significant risks. The one that we know it doesn't carry is potential for abuse. This is a long-standing myth that has been repeatedly debunked. Animal models that have looked at this particular feature reveal that classical serotonergic psychedelics lack reinforcing effects, which is the eagerness to be under the effect of the drug. The animals tend to not only not seek the drug, they actually tend to show aversion to their effects. And this is something that we can replicate in humans. These are some of the adverse events that can occur upon exposure to psychedelics, and as Matthew Johnson was aware of observing psilocybin studies, and there's reasons to be cautious about certain aspects of it. So yeah, blood pressure is something that's commonly observed in clinical studies across the board, which would definitely really limit their use in individuals with underlying cardiovascular condition. And like he mentioned, also another point of caution is related to the ability to trigger psychotic episodes in individuals that have an underlying risk. And I'm thinking about schizophrenia. But to put this in context on how this alone does not justify their place in a Schedule 1, dexamethasone, a commonly used anti-inflammatory drug that has saved the life of many people throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, is also able to trigger what we denominate as drug-induced psychosis. And one point of caution as well is that not all the risk resides on the molecules themselves. Research on psychedelics is exposed to threats that emerge directly from our suggestible nature. Microdosing, for instance, receives enormous media coverage, yet the best available evidence, using the closest we can get to a blinding gold standard, shows that its effect is indistinguishable from placebo. The same applies for the so-called pollen effects, which describes the inflated expectations of some people's eagerness to engage in psychedelic therapy. So society, we need to be ready to challenge our subjective experience if the data fails to support what our mind believes to be effective. But by the same token, legislation on psychedelics need to be adequate and updated to match our current scientific evidence. The demonstration of psychedelics therapeutic potential is work in progress, yet the currently available evidence converts to support the psychedelics, regardless of origin, can bring alleviation to people whose mental health is compromised by anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. On the other side of the coin, psychedelics carry manageable risks, as overall they have been proven to be rather safe drugs for human use. It is on the FDA's hand to make the final call on efficacy and safety, but the available body of science does not justify psychedelics placement on the most restrictive legal category for drugs, or making them a law enforcement priority. Use of psychedelics in the community in Virginia is bound to happen regardless, but they hardly ever pose a threat that will bring individuals into the justice system. I'll conclude my segment with an anecdotal remark. DMT, the active component of ayahuasca, what makes ayahuasca psychedelic, has been identified in the human brain. It's an endogenous chemical, albeit in trace levels. Its relevance is unclear, but it serves well as a paradox of the legal status of psychedelics. Something that lives within us can be subjected to legal prosecution. With that, I would like to conclude my part and invite anyone with questions to reach out to my email. And now I would like to pass on the baton to David Sifu, Herman J. Flax Professor and Chair of the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation and National Director for the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs PMR program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario and others. Let's see, and the previous speakers for teaching me a lot about the things that perhaps I missed in medical school. My name is Dr. Dave Seafew. I'm a rehabilitation physician working at VCU in the Richmond VA. Before I begin, I want to extend my thanks to Senator Hashmi and Delegate Adams, as well as Dr. Mark Miller for bringing together this esteemed panel on this important topic. So I'm coming to you as a clinician and a person that is taking care of veterans, athletes, civilians for more than 30 years who have a range of difficulties, from traumatic brain injuries to mental health issues to suicide risk to chronic pain. And I'm not going to just talk to you today, albeit briefly, about plant-based approaches or decriminalizing nature, which is the essence of this, and I will integrate that in. But what I'm going to talk to you about is how important it is that we as researchers, individuals, and physicians look at an integrative or whole health approach to care for some of the complex issues we're speaking of today. I've been taking care of the most, what I believe, are very challenging individuals in terms of their difficulties for 3 decades. And these are folks that have combat exposures and come back with injuries to their bodies, their brains, their psyches, and often all 3. And there is not a single treatment for any of these conditions. On this first slide here, you'll see the wheel of integrative health or whole health. And what that indicates is that the human brain, the human psyche, the human body is rather complex. And people that believe that they're gonna get well just by taking a single pill or doing an X-ray scan or having a surgery are fairly naive to the way the body works. But how do we integrate all of these important interventions together and balance them in a way that produces the right outcome. And these plant-based substances we're talking about today are part of that process, and they can be an important part. You've heard the research today, and it's pretty amazing. I mean, the research that you've heard today indicates that many of these substances work as well as the accepted care that we're doing, and certainly in the practice that we have across the VA. There's increasing interest in using these and integrating them. It's not a single approach. So on this slide in front of you that you see in the center, I see the other slide to the left, but in the center, it's balancing these things. So there may be a role for these agents as a way to kick off care for individuals that are suffering from post-traumatic stress, from combat-related, sports-related, civilian-related issues. And they may be the right thing to start with, or they may be what's needed in the middle after they've begun on a traditional approach of balancing standard medications, exercise, et cetera. So it isn't one or the other. It's all of these things taken in consideration, under the care of clinicians who understand all of these aspects and who respect the role of all of these contributions. Myself, I'm a passionate believer in the role of nutrition, exercise, mindfulness, restorative sleep in healing just about anything. I take care of individuals that have seen extensive combat, that I've seen folks that are in coma for long periods of time. I see folks that are suffering from chronic pain, and it's balancing all of these things, but you need to begin with the foundation of wellness, and then these things will work. And there's, as you've heard, significantly increasing research, and congratulations to my colleagues at Johns Hopkins for that awesome NIH grant that's really going to begin to study these things even better. But anyway, so it's important. It's not one thing or the other, and it isn't, well, let's decriminalize it or criminalize it. It's how do we use these substances in partnership with other proven entities, and some a little less proven, but how do we balance them? And how do we allow the individual that's injured to take charge and to help run it? How do we make this patient-centric? And that's what we do at the VA, that's what we do at VCU, is what we do in my rehabilitation practice. So, this is just this is a simplification of what we're looking at. And importantly, we are looking at preventing not just one disease state with some of the treatments we're talking about today, or this integration. We're talking about keeping the entire organism, human organism, alive and well and operating. And so, it's important that we're looking at all of the things on this screen. We're looking at how do we integrate some of these plant-based approaches, whether that's your diet, or whether that's a medication or a psychoactive agent. How do we integrate them into the overall life? Because if you think just taking a magic mushroom is going to get you all well, then you are missing the whole concept behind healthcare and wellness. It really is an integration of all these facts. So I would just encourage everyone out there to think about, how do we look at overall wellness? How can we bring some of these agents into that care in a mindful way, looking at science, looking at the individualized or personalized approach, but always keeping in mind that the human body is not simple. It's not based on one thing. We're not one new medication or vaccine or injection or surgery away from wellness. It is a lifetime effort. You need to build your foundation and then build your wellness home on top of that, and keep nurturing it and keep your mind open to some of these new things. So I'm very excited to be part of this overarching effort, strongly in favor of the integration of these plant-based solutions into a wellness strategy and into treatment strategies. But most importantly, I am privileged to be part of this overall team, and also to be really privileged to be on this veterans panel, because I share it with two gentlemen that you're about to hear from, who don't just talk the talk, but walk the walk. And they are veterans that have served in our armed forces, and they deserve nothing but love and respect. And it's my privilege to be on a panel with them. At this point, let me transition to the first of these veterans, Mr. Wiley Gray, who from the United States Marine Corps and the founder of Veterans for War. Wiley, to you.
Hi, thank you so much. I want to start by thanking Senator Hashmi and Delegate Adams and Dr. Miller. Thank you also, Dr. Seafu, for that very important update on looking at this more holistically and not as a silver bullet or a cure-all, which is something that I have to say quite a bit to my participants. My name is Wiley Gray, as was stated. I'm a Manassas resident. My kid goes to Sedley Elementary School out here in Manassas, as a matter of fact. My nonprofit is here in Manassas also. What we do as a nonprofit is we connect teams of veterans to guided psychedelic group therapy designed to heal the scars of war. I want to talk a little bit, we've gotten a lot of information that's super important and critical to understanding the educational side of why this is such an important bill to push forward. The first thing I want to talk about is what it looks like as a veteran, how it feels to be on the ground floor and trying to deal with mental health care problems. And I want to stress before I start that exactly echoing what Dr. Seafu said, these medicines, and I use the word plant medicine purposefully so that it's not confused with things that are scheduled. These medicines should be seen as another tool to add to the recovery toolbox. They're not meant to replace the entire continuum of care that we've developed. They're meant to work in conjunction and supplement that care and hopefully provide better long-term positive outcomes. So as was said, I spent 8.5 years active duty in the Marines. During that time, I deployed twice in support of the global war on terror. My final duty was to be the ammunition chief of an artillery battery forward deployed in Helmand Valley in Afghanistan. In real time, what that meant was that my job was to basically give beans, bullets, and band-aids to my unit and make sure that they could be operationally capable 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In a howitzer unit and an artillery unit, what that means is we're firing 155 millimeter high explosive bombs on the enemy about every 10 seconds. And for me, that lasted about a month and a half of direct operations. When I came home, I didn't know how much my brain had changed. It took a couple years for some of the symptomology that's associated with PTSD to express itself for me. What I had to deal with in real time was insomnia, rage, hypervigilance, extreme anxiety, extreme depression, and suicidal thoughts and ideations. This was something I dealt with for years on my own. I went to the VA. I tried to find recovery through the, quote, appropriate means. And what I was told was that essentially my brain chemistry had changed. And the main solutions that they could offer were talk therapy, group therapy, or medication. And in this case, it was SSRIs. As was alluded to earlier by, I believe, Dr. Maestro, so some of these medicines take a couple of months before you can even feel their optimal effects. If you're someone that's dealing with immediate suicidal ideations and thoughts, you might not have a couple of months. That's the reality. While operations at Veterans of War have been incredibly lucky to keep finding a way to be flexible during this pandemic, what it's really shown to us is the absolute failures in some of our mental health care systems in place. So a sobering statistic that I like to think about, especially as it applies here in the United States and in the state of Virginia, is that 120 Americans commit suicide every day, 120 Americans. Of that subset, or of that set, a subset of 20 Americans a day, which are veterans, commit suicide. We make up a little over 5% of the population, and we're overrepresented in the suicide statistic category by a factor of 4. This is an epidemic in my community. We are hemorrhaging men and women every day to a preventable outcome. If you unpack that number at all, you'll realize that we lose more veterans a year to a preventable outcome than we've lost in close to 20 years of active duty combat operations. And that's every single year. So our approach as a community, as a nation, to this overwhelming problem of mental health care is simply not sufficient to the task. and we need to change it. We've listened to a lot of people talk about the safety of these medicines specifically. What I'm here to talk about is do they work? We can show, in labs, we can show with animals, we can show with small populations of veterans that they're incredibly effective. I can tell you with firsthand experience that it shifted the trajectory of my life and brought me back home. It allowed me to recover in a way that I didn't think was physically possible before. Moreover, when I started operations with veterans of war to help other veterans find that same level of healing, invariably, they had the same response again and again. I think it's important to note and to make I think, a very direct mention of two specific factors. The first is we wouldn't have these medicines whatsoever without the indigenous people all over the world protecting their own traditions to ensure that these medicines are able to serve us. And the second is that these medicines don't, as was said earlier, don't work on a single, necessarily on just a single application, call me in the morning, which is kind of the Western model of medical care for the last, well, my whole lifetime, about 40 years. What these medicines represent is a drastic shift in the paradigm of mental health care recovery. And what I mean by that is that they're interactive. There's a significant portion of taking a plant medicine that has to deal with reprogramming some of your own trauma in your own brain, that has to deal with sometimes reliving some very personally traumatic or extremely difficult memories themselves as you're in these reverie states or ecstatic states that can be brought on. These are incredibly profound, and they represent sometimes nothing less than a complete shift in consciousness. And for that very reason, I think that anybody that is ethically worth their salt in this game will tell you that it's absolutely critical that we have access to life-saving medicine. But I think just as critical is that we safeguard by creating a left and right bracket for the experience itself. It needs to be contained in a program that helps prepare the participants for what's about to happen, gives them tools to navigate during its application, and moreover, supports the integration process on the back end after they've had medicine. Just as important to the medicine itself is the integration of that medicine work on the other end. When these things are done appropriately, it's nothing less than life-changing and life-saving. I've seen this in my own life. I've seen this in the veterans that I serve, and I continue to advocate for it on a national scale, specifically because if we've seen anything during this pandemic, it's absolutely exposed the need for mental health care solutions, and also exposed that when people see something that works, they will take drastic means to have access to it. If we don't find a way to regulate and legislate this appropriately, we're not going to be supporting long-term positive outcomes. We're going to be supporting a black market, because at this point, there are reams of evidence that show that this works. We just need to have the right distribution model to ensure that what we are getting is delivered in a way that meets our interests and sees us as holistic, not just consumers, but people. And that's one of the main reasons why I work with the veteran community in a nonprofit status. This is too important. It represents a change that all humans can benefit from potentially. And I'm happy to be a part of the veteran model that shows its efficacy. But at the same time, I would caution as we move forward that we ensure that we pay into the local traditions that have kept it alive, and that we create an access point that upholds the ethical traditions that we're trying to create in our model of medicine distribution. All in all, I think that medicines like psilocybin represent a safe and effective path towards a recovery. And at a time when most of the world is suffering under more than 2 years of a global pandemic, we absolutely need effective and safe solutions. With that being said, I'm going to hand over the next speaking portion to John Lubecki, who is a participant in the MAPS Phase 2 trial and the founder of the Lubecki Strategic Direction. John?
Thanks, Wiley. And thank you for your service. One of the things to consider that Wiley brought up is 129 Americans do commit suicide every day. And that's every day going back decades. And then we don't have the results yet for last year, only because there's a delay. And that's something that needs to be kept in the back of everyone's mind. While I understand FDA processes and the need for research, every day that people don't have access to this is another day where somebody dies. And while we're talking about these, I also want to say PTSD is often thought of this thing that's the same for everyone. And it's actually a very personal experience based on the trauma that you experience, how much trauma you've gone through, and how that trauma affected your brain. Myself, I served 4 years in the Marine Corps, 8 years in the Army. I deployed to Iraq 2005, 2006. The base I was on was mortared over 6,000 times while I was there. I got blown up in a porta-john, which is the crappiest place to get blown up, but you don't get to pick it. I came back with severe PTSD. Part of the reason I got PTSD is because I had early childhood trauma. I was abused by my parents growing up, which unfortunately with the military and veterans in particular, the people who are willing to volunteer for the military and leave home and leave their family for extended periods of time, typically either one are legacies. Their whole family's been in the military. The idea of that is just their normal. But most other people, it's because they've suffered some form of early childhood trauma. It may not be like me where I was abused. It could be they grew up in a crime-ridden neighborhood and they saw things, as a 5-year-old. And that sets the stage for PTSD in the military. When I came home from Iraq, I was home for about 60 days before I put a gun to my head and I pulled the trigger. That was the first time. It was a manufacturing defect in the ammunition. The second time I did that was broken spring. I've tried to overdose and I've slipped my wrist twice. I've been hospitalized all over an 8-year period. I went to the VA. I did what Wiley did. When you come home and you start having these bad thoughts, we're all told, go to the VA, go to the doctor. And we do. And the treatments that they have are highly effective for some people because PTSD isn't the same for everyone. It's a spectrum. For some people, honestly, going to church, going to the gym, yoga, meditation is all they really need. Some people, SSRI a day keeps the demons away. Other people, like myself, like Wiley, none of that was effective. I was on 42 pills a day from the VA when I had my last suicide attempt. I was in group therapy. I was in individual therapy, and none of it worked. None of it could make my brain not want to end my life each and every day. So after my final suicide attempt on November 4th, 2013, I'd pretty much given up. I'd tried to take my life in ways that should have been successful 5 times. It was just a matter of time before I did not exist. And I was at the VA at one of my appointments with an intern who is probably one of the first people that actually read the stacks and stacks of my entire mental health. And they slid a piece of paper across the desk, said, don't open this until after you leave because I'm not allowed to tell you about this. So after I leave, I opened the piece of paper and it had 3 words on it that changed my life. And it said, Google MDMA PTSD. So I went home and I did. And I discovered that MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, was doing an MDMA-assisted therapy trial right down the street from my house. I called them, told them about my situation. They accepted me into the trial. And over a 4-month period, I did 3 8-hour sessions under the influence of MDMA with 2 specially trained therapists. And at the end of it, I didn't have PTSD. The nightmares went away. The suicidal ideation disappeared. I haven't thought of killing myself in 7 years. And I've taken MDMA 3 times in my life as part of the clinical trial. I have used plant medicines. I've done ayahuasca twice as part of a religious ceremony. And to be honest, it actually didn't work for me. did absolutely nothing. I just sat there bored. So one thing to consider, these medicines don't always work on everyone, just like, SSRIs don't work on a lot of people. And I've also used psilocybin mushrooms recently because last year I lost my service dog at 14 and a half years. And within the past 12 months, I've lost both of my parents. But I can tell you the interesting thing, even though I'm suffering from depression, I know, one, it's distinctly different from PTSD. I also know that there's a solution and a fix, and it's helpful. My son, 2 years ago, almost died on a cruise ship to the point where he was life flighted by the Coast Guard off of a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean. And because of that, my son has PTSD. And one, I will say, I have zero qualms with him using any of these substances in a supervised fashion with a therapist as a father, because I know how well they work. And I know that this isn't just, hey, let's go all get high and it's all some sort of joke. This genuinely works. And in talking with my son's therapist, the thing that has amazed her the most is the fact that while my son has PTSD, he does not have depression. And the reason he doesn't have depression, like just about everybody who has PTSD, is because he doesn't believe PTSD is a permanent condition, because he has seen my life. And this is where, Wiley talking and me talking brings a lot of hope to veterans, because too many veterans right now don't know this exists. They don't believe or know that there's help. Before I ever joined the military and had PTSD, while I was in the military, before I had it and after I had it, and for 8 years, I was told, and I believe, that PTSD and other acquired mental conditions are chronic, lifelong mental illnesses that once acquired is your new normal. We can mitigate symptoms, but this is your new life. And the thing is, that's not true. PTSD is a mental injury. It can be healed in 4 months. I'm living proof of this. It's just like a broken bone. And I don't know anybody who breaks their bone and says, falls down the stairs, breaks your leg, gets up, and doesn't go to the hospital and isn't given very, very powerful drugs, and no one bats an eye on it. I don't know anyone who sits there and says, no, I'm fine. I'm just going to limp around with it in pain for the rest of my life and watch it debilitate me further and further as life goes on. And that's what I want mental health to be. I want everyone to believe and know that this can be healed. But in order to do that, they have to have access to these various substances. And while I took MDMA, that is one substance for one condition. All you need to do is look at the range of psychedelics that are out there. They all affect people slightly differently. Some people may react better to MDMA. Some may react better to ayahuasca or ibogaine, or ibogaine 5-MeO-DMT mixed, or psilocybin. We need to have the cornucopia of solutions available so we stop losing veterans. Just this week, I had to hospitalize 2 veterans. I'm not a doctor. These were I was able to talk them into going into the hospital with law enforcement present. This is a real thing when you get on boots on ground. It's very easy to sit back and read the headlines or skip past them of what's happening to the veteran community and the mental health crisis that all Americans are currently facing. It's a lot harder when you get a call every night of somebody in distress who may not be there. And these medicines are the sole reason that my son, one, believes that he will be healed of PTSD, and he will. But it's also the reason that he has a father instead of a folded flag. And with that, I would like to introduce Victor McKenzie, who is the executive director of the executive director of the Substance Abuse and Addiction Recovery Alliance of Virginia.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Delegate Adams and Senator Hashmi and Dr. Miller for putting such a wonderful event together, and to all the previous speakers. Once again, my name is Victor McKenzie, and I'm the Executive Director of the Substance Abuse and Addiction Recovery Alliance. We are a statewide organization that advocates, educates, and supports individuals and families affected by substance use disorder. And for us, it's important to deploy every viable resource in our toolbox in order to help individuals on their addiction journey and to a path of recovery. And that's what we see plant medicine as. And now more than ever, it's needed. A recent Wall Street Journal article showed that for the first time, we reached 100,000 overdeaths, fatal overdeaths in our nation. And that troubling trend is shown up here in Virginia. Last year in Richmond alone, 150% increase in overdose deaths. So it's certainly needed. And the benefits of plant medicine can be used with those who need mental health and substance use treatment. Mental health issues such as PSD, depression, anxiety are all factors that lead to substance use disorder. And it's a domino effect, frankly. Unfortunately, it leaves people homeless, jobless, loss of life. So the effects go so far beyond that initial use. And so that's why we believe plant medicine should be reviewed and considered to be decriminalized first for medical use and for mental health and substance use disorder. And Matthew Johnson mentioned earlier, and a few other speakers, that the potential harm is far less than other substances such as opioids and fentanyl and other things along those lines. And we've seen such a positive impact for certain individuals who utilize medically assisted treatment. So we know this is a viable path. This could also provide the push for having research for some plant medicines that can help in the treatment of reversing effects of substance use disorder. If successful, this research and practices can be administered and beneficial into the line of work of our comprehensive harm reduction programs, our hospitals, our clinician offices, and other forms of treatments. And with considering the increased Medicaid reimbursement, something we're certainly fighting for here in Virginia, this can really help out with physicians, hospital visits for those seeking treatment, and they can utilize plant medicine under their insurance. Plant medicine pours directly into a lot of things. If considered, could really be a 180 for people. And we don't believe it's a cure-all or a silver bullet, which you'll hear myself and previous speakers, but we do believe it is a viable option and something we certainly need to explore further. And with that, I will pass it to Dr. Foster from Hemp Haven.
Good morning, all. Thank you for allowing me to participate, and I'm going to be sharing my screen. So please be patient as I figure out that technology. Thank you. So good morning, Senator Hashmi, Delegate Adams, honored attendees, and esteemed colleagues. My name is Denise Foster, and I am here today to present on the plant-based medicine known as cannabis. I present to you today from the heart of a cannabis nurse. As a registered nurse with over 37 years of professional practice in administrative, clinical, and academic settings, I am an advocate for this plant. And I have been educating and coaching communities and individuals across the country about the use of cannabis as medicine from the perspective of a professional expert for the past 6 years. My goal is simple. I want to help change the world. I am sure that it is no surprise that unlike other plants presented here, cannabis has already been decriminalized. I share this review to illustrate that Virginia has already led the way to legalizing a well-researched plant for medicinal purposes. With Governor Northam legalizing cannabis for recreational use this year, Our Commonwealth is poised to begin the process of providing safe access to cannabis in communities across Virginia. Governor-elect Youngkin has made Virginia's mental health system a top priority. But wait, there's more. The 2018 Agricultural Improvement Act removed hemp and derivatives of cannabis with extremely low concentrations of Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol from the definition of marijuana in the Controlled Substances Act. Cannabis and hemp are cousins. They are mirror opposites, in fact, with hemp now legal across the United States. Hemp-derived medicines are known for their exogenous cannabinoids, with CBD taking the spotlight since legalization. CBD has been upheld in study after study as an effective therapeutic for stress, anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Cannabis is a success story of plant decriminalization, and we should now be considering how to focus on how to design and develop studies that will focus on safe, effective use of cannabis, but also on the use of other plant-derived medicines that have already shown promise as use in the mental health population. A brief snapshot reminds us of what cannabis looked like as an illegal substance. This demonstrates the staggering consequences associated with plant-based prohibition. In 2018, cannabis arrests in Virginia hit their highest levels with nearly 29,000 arrests made for offenses, a number that had tripled since 1999. In 2018, of those arrested, a clear racial disparity was evident, as 49% of those arrested for a first offense for possession of cannabis were African Americans, despite being only 20% of our population, and 51% of those were found guilty. A 2016 Cato Institute report estimated that Virginia spent $81 million on cannabis enforcement. When we consider the amount of Virginia's revenues spent on cannabis offenses in just the past few years, it begs the question, what if we were to use those funds for research and programs to support our mental health population? And when we consider the impact that plant-related offenses has on individuals, primarily young men, veterans, and people of color, we can see the harsh prosecution for this nonviolent crime has affected many Virginians. Individuals who were previously linked to cannabis offenses experienced limitations on their future housing, education, and employment opportunities, not to mention the enormous toll on their mental well-being. With decriminalization now and legalization, prior arrests, charges, or convictions for possessing or selling cannabis are being removed from the public view, and the issue of sealing and expunging criminal records could be revisited again next year. Let's turn our attention to the mental health in Virginia and how cannabis has been shown as a promising theory to support mental well-being. From the National Alliance on Mental Illness, our data reveal that 1.2 million Virginians have a mental health condition, and approximately 75% of those affected are diagnosed by age 24. Yet only 4 out of every 10 Virginians receives mental health treatment. Over 2 million Virginians live in an area where it has no access to mental health professionals, and about the same number are booked into jail because they did not get the treatment needed for their mental health disorder. 1 out of every 8 emergency department visits involves a mental health or a substance use condition. Depression is the #1 leading cause of disability, costing $193 billion in lost earnings across America. Most significantly, 1 American dies by suicide every 12 minutes, with a rate of 16.9 deaths per 100,000 in Virginia alone. For veterans, this rate is much higher, with 23.5 deaths per suicide per 100,000. Anxiety, depression, and PTSD are inextricably linked as comorbidities. And while there are contradictory reports that indicate heavy use of cannabis can be associated with higher incidences of these disorders, there is a paucity of research to fully understand how cannabis can be used to treat mental health concerns. Compounding the issue is that most studies to date have focused on the use of medical or recreational cannabis, which is only available through either a state-run dispensary or the illicit drug market. Yet cannabis in any form has been shown to interact with a fundamental system in our human body, the endocannabinoid system. This is a physiological system in the body that was discovered in the 1990s. The system plays numerous important roles in the human body, as it is responsible for our survival as a master regulator, helping our body to maintain homeostasis, which is the balance between external and internal equilibrium. When we focus on the interactions of cannabis with the endocannabinoid system, in the brain, we can see that there are many areas in which emotional, mood, and behavioral disorders can be targeted for treatment. It is beyond the scope of this presentation to discuss the numerous psychological benefits that cannabis, especially in hemp form, has been associated with as a mental health treatment. This is mainly due to its interactions with our human endocannabinoid system. Studies have indicated that integration of cannabis in both hemp and marijuana forms influences the functioning of the endocannabinoid system to regulate psychological disorders, as well as an effective treatment for pain. According to Dr. Nora Valkow, I'm sorry, my presentation seems to be messing up. According to Dr. Nora Valkow, who is the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, cannabis and the ECS have long been seen as targets for the development of medications for the treatment of many psychiatric disorders. Of particular interest has been the potential for the treatment of anxiety disorders such as PTSD. This hypothesis is further strengthened by a vast amount of anecdotal stories and case reports, often presented as so-called evidence that cannabis can dramatically reduce PTSD-related flashbacks, panic attacks, and self-mutilation. From my own professional cannabis nursing practice, I concur with Dr. Valkow's observation that there is an overwhelming amount of anecdotal evidence that suggests that cannabis has been helpful to treat anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Over the past several years, I have worked with individuals who have either decreased or eliminated their harmful pharmaceuticals and substituted with cannabis, a safer alternative. There is overwhelming, albeit nascent, research that suggests cannabis has a positive influence on anxiety, depression, and PTSD. We know this because as first cannabis became decriminalized, then legalized across the globe, the number of research studies skyrocketed. The number for publications on cannabis and its interactions in the body increased 9-fold between 2000 and 2017. To date, over 35,000 scientific papers related to cannabis are listed in PubMed, with 66% of all scientific papers originating from authors in the United States. In 2020, researchers worldwide published a record 3,500 plus scientific papers on the subject of cannabis. I would like to leave this distinguished audience with this final thought. My presentation today is dedicated to and in honor of Richard Trey Paradiso III. Trey was born in 1985 in Frankfurt, Germany, in the same hospital his uncle and brother were born in due to him being a fourth-generation soldier. He was a graduate of Frank W. Cox High School, Longwood University, and was just 2 classes short of a dual MBA and a strategic leadership master's degree from Western Governors University. While at Fort Story, Trey deployed twice to combat in Iraq, once as a staff command officer and once as a company commander. He was an exceptional commander who truly loved his soldiers, and they loved him. Unfortunately, Trey learned the hard way that the Army did not deal well with severe mental illness, and he was asked to terminate his service. This only further to sink him into his depression. Following his discharge, Trey worked closely with the Veterans Affairs and was classified as 100% disabled for his illnesses. While he tried valiantly to live on his own, he needed the help and support of his parents and lived with them for the past 5 years of his life. Ultimately, depression continued to affect Trey. After years of continued anguish, he believed it. Trey was remarkable. He made an impression on every person to have had the fortune to meet him. Trey took his own life on December 1st, 2021. He was 36 years young. For Trey, decriminalization of plant-based medicine and mental health support arrived too late. I speak now to serve as a voice for Trey and for all those who continue to suffer from mental health disorders. Through the long process of cannabis legalization, Virginia has now joined 34 states to allow access to cannabis in one form or another. Virginia must now focus on research to support the use of cannabis and other plant-based medicines to improve mental health treatment while offering a non-pharmaceutical approach with which to end the ongoing cycle of anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Thank you for allowing to participate in this historic conference. I would especially like to thank Senator Hashmi and Delegate Adams for introducing legalization associated with this important topic that speaks to the mental well-being of Virginia's population. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Brian Files, who is here to share his own personal story of how these plants helped him overcome his depression when all other traditional treatments were unsuccessful.
Thank you, Dr. Foster, and thank you to Senator Hashmi and Delegate Adams for sponsoring this conference. I also want to recognize the hard work that Will and Mark and so many others have put into this event to help educate other Virginians about the safety and efficacy of these plants. Finally, I want to thank all of the other speakers today for contributing to this important conversation about the healing properties of these often misunderstood substances. I'll be honest, when I first saw the credentials of all the distinguished panelists, I felt maybe Mark and Will had made a mistake by inviting me to speak. You see, all my education, professional experience is business related. I mean, I have lots of fancy letters after my name, but they're all centered around helping companies increase productivity, maximize profits, those kinds of things. I want to be clear, I am not a clinical researcher, so I have absolutely no idea how these medicines work. I am also not a psychiatrist, so I am completely unqualified to share any data on their efficacy in treating specific conditions or illnesses. I have no slides to share with you, no charts, no cool infographics to put up on the screen. All I have to share today is my own personal story of how a tiny little mushroom saved my life. Like so many others out there, I've spent most of my life struggling with depression. No matter how good my life appeared on the outside, this darkness grew inside me every day like a cancer. It started in my teens, a few rough days here and there, nothing I couldn't push through. But after high school, I joined the Coast Guard. And let's just say that life aboard an icebreaker during the cold, long, dark winters, not exactly the best environment for someone already struggling with depression. I left the service and life got really busy for me. In the span of just 5 years, I got my degree from VCU, go Rams, married the love of my life. We've been married 30 years now. I became a certified public accountant. I started my professional career and became a father of 2 amazing boys. All of this stress served as both a distraction from, but also an expedient excuse for my depression. Unfortunately, my episodes just continued to get worse. And not only were they becoming more frequent, but they also started to last weeks instead of months. I tried all of the traditional treatments like talk therapy, antidepressants, even some weird fringe treatments, but none of them worked. Each day I just kept falling deeper into this bottomless pit of misery. Finally, just a couple years ago, these emotional tumors that were growing inside me metastasized and consumed everything that was beautiful in my life. My family watched helplessly as the depression ate me from the inside until nothing but suffering remained. I was convinced the only path to peace that I so desperately wanted was death. So like many others on this call today, one random day I grabbed a gun, a single bullet, and I quietly snuck out my back door like I was going to the store. No notes explaining my decision, no cryptic text messages pleading for help. I just needed this pain to stop. Fortunately for me, my wife, and my children, I couldn't find the courage to pull the trigger that day. But like some others on this call, I knew it was only a matter of time until I did. So I was trapped. I was trapped between being too scared to kill myself and too sad to go on living. I had never felt more defeated my entire life. Not long after that incident, I stumbled on an article about how psychedelics were being used to treat all sorts of conditions, including depression. So I spent the next several months reading articles, reading books, watching videos on the topic. At my core, I am a skeptical person, but the scientific evidence and personal stories of healing were just so compelling. The more I learned, the more convinced I became. I knew that I had to give this a try, but that proved a little easier said than done. The first obstacle I had to overcome was my own fear. You see, I was just 11 when Nancy Reagan's Just Say No anti-drug campaign came out. And I guess all those Saturday morning public service announcements with Mr. T and Brooke Shields worked because I had gone 44 years of my life without touching an illegal substance of any kind, nothing. I remembered that scary moment of that commercial with the frying pan and worried maybe these substances would actually turn my brain into a fried egg. That's a powerful image for a young boy. Then I started to worry maybe they would instantly turn me into a full-blown hippie and I'd be required to like sell all my possessions, grow a man bun, live on a commune somewhere, and we'd make our own clothes. And if I'm being honest, tie-dye and Birkenstocks is not a great look for me. But my primary concern, and all joking aside, was related to my job. As you know, many of these substances are illegal in the United States, and I knew my career would be over in an instant if I was convicted of a drug-related felony. But I was also concerned they might just fire me, even if they just found out what I had done. It was a big obstacle for me. But at this point, I was willing to do anything to treat my depression. So eventually I got comfortable with the risks of breaking the law, but I was faced with an entirely new problem. Like, how do you even go about finding this medicine? You can't exactly pop into CVS and ask the pharmacist for some mushrooms. So in one of the books I was reading, it suggested I start by attending one of the various plant-based medicine support groups that are out there, or a conference like this one that are out in the community. I found just such a conference in Pittsburgh and drove 7 hours in the car to attend this 2-day event. However, I quickly learned when you look like an undercover DEA agent, folks aren't exactly lining up to answer your questions about illegal substances. The next few months were really frustrating as every path I seemed to hit a dead end. I couldn't get into clinical trials. I couldn't find it on the black market. I was really frustrated. I was just about to give up on the whole idea when I found out that these treatments are completely legal in many parts of the world. Traveling overseas was an expensive option, but at least I would not have to risk being prosecuted for trying to treat my depression. It wasn't long before I was in the Netherlands, attending a 5-day retreat with 15 other strangers where I took a significant dose of psilocybin. I don't have time today to get in and share all the details of my journey, but I can tell you it was the most profound and transformative experience of my entire life. I'm happy to share that I've been depression-free for over 2 years. Something I never imagined was possible. And I owe it all to these plants. They put me on a path of healing that would not have been possible without them. You see, my depression and my PTSD was also had a source. Like many others, I was sexually abused as a young child. The trauma of those events broke that little boy. And for 40 years, I tried to hide my secret from everyone, including myself. Not even my parents knew the pain that I was carrying with me all these years. But the more I tried to push it down deep inside me, the more damage that it did. I read somewhere that trauma is like a massive splinter under our skin that causes a horrible infection. It's our body's response to that foreign object that becomes the problem in some ways more than the object itself. And for 40 years, that infection festered and spread throughout my mind, body, and spirit until it almost killed me. These plants did something that no other treatment was able to do. It showed me that the path to healing was directly through the pain and misery that I've been trying so hard to avoid. I was terrified to pull out that splinter of my abuse, but I know my healing couldn't start until I did. I still have lots of healing to do. To that end, I belong to a great plant medicine support group. I try to meditate every day, and I have an amazing therapist who helps me process everything that the medicine and my integration have shown me. But it would be misleading for me or anyone to suggest that all you have to do is swallow a few mushrooms and you're suddenly cured of all that ails you. These plants are not magic, but they are a powerful and essential tool when integrated with commitment to change and other treatments like talk therapy and community support. They can be life-changing. There are so many people with experiences just like mine, but they remain hidden in the shadows. Decriminalizing these substances would allow them to step out into light and share their stories and provide their support to others facing similar circumstances. I would have never have found my way to this medicine without people like this. Veterans need to know that these plants show significant promise in treating PTSD. They help survivors of sexual, emotional, and physical abuse like me heal their souls and treat their depression. Studies have shown they relieve the anxiety of terminally ill cancer patients as they face their own mortality. And there's compelling evidence that these substances can help people break the addiction to these dangerous drugs that are devastating entire communities. Unfortunately, most people cannot afford to spend $5,000 traveling to Europe for treatment. And why should they have to? These are naturally occurring plants that you can grow in your garden. And there's nothing new about these treatments. Many of these plants have been safely used for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years by indigenous populations. It's time that we end this prohibition on these substances that have such extraordinary potential to help so many. Knowing what I do today, I would have risked physical imprisonment if it meant breaking the emotional chains of the depression that kept me locked up for so many years. But nobody should be forced to have to make that decision, that trade-off. That's why I respectfully ask that each of you consider decriminalizing these plants so that we can give other Virginians access to the same healing that I found without having to fear arrest or prosecution. These plants are many, many things, but as we've learned today, dangerous is certainly not one of them. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it shed some light on these plants, and my story of healing has opened your heart to consider decriminalizing these substances and providing others access to this healing. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Jesse Rabinowitz, a Richmond area clinical psychologist who's prepared a pre-recorded message for us today. I'll turn it over to Jesse.
Hi, my name is Jesse Rabinowitz. I'm a clinical psychologist in the Richmond, Virginia area, and have been practicing there for about 35 years. I have been aware over many, many years of the research and anecdotal reports of therapeutic benefit of plant medicines with a variety of different patient groups, and have known many people over many years who have experienced benefits from this. In my clinical practice, I have had a number of patients who suffer from the kinds of difficulties being talked about this morning: intractable depression, bipolar depression, PTSD, who have become stuck in their treatment regardless of the fact that they were receiving intensive therapy as well as psychiatric med management. Of those patients, a number of them have themselves become aware of the research in recent years into the plant medicines and their benefits, and they have wanted to pursue those kinds of options. They've been frustrated. I've been somewhat frustrated that I couldn't refer them for that kind of work because it wasn't available in the Commonwealth. And some of them have pursued experiences with plant medicines where they could find them to great effect. I have patients who have deepened their work in profound ways and found a good deal of relief and liberation from the ways they were stuck as a result of their experiences with plant medicines. I'd certainly like to see these medicines decriminalized in the Commonwealth and available for individuals and for practitioners who want to use this kind of treatment modality to benefit their patients, not to mention continuing research into the action and the benefits of these medicines. So I'm very grateful to be able to speak in support of this initiative, and very, very grateful to Delegate Adams and Senator Hashmi for being willing to be part of creating this conference and to push a legislative initiative in this direction. I think it will have great benefit for the citizens of the Commonwealth and will alleviate considerable suffering that at this point seems to me to be needless in light of the recent research and anecdotal reports of the positive benefits of plant medicine. I want to thank all of you out there that are members of the General Assembly for opening up to these possibilities, for considering the research evidence, and for hearing from those of us that are out there doing practice and would like to see our patients experience the benefits that these medicines offer. Thank you very much.
So I want to thank Jesse and Brian for what they shared. Brian, from my heart, thank you so much for sharing from your heart. At this point, I want to turn it over to Carlos Plazola. Carlos is Decriminalize Nature, co-founder of Decriminalize Nature National. So I'm going to turn it right on over to Carlos.
Thank you, Mark. And I want to thank Senator Hashmi and Delegate Adams for this opportunity and for giving us such a great forum to present to this morning. I want to start first by introducing myself, speaking about my own personal journey. And I apologize, it's a bit early here in the West Coast, so I'll work my way through this with coffee next to me here. I'll speak about my own personal journey and then what led to the emergence of Decriminalize Nature. And if I fulfill my role here this morning, I will convince you of the importance of decriminalizing before legalizing and decriminalizing without limits to enable everyone to heal, particularly those who are the most vulnerable in our society. I'd like to start by telling my own story here. First, I'm the chair of Decriminalize Nature, which was founded in early 2019 here in Oakland, California, and has now spread throughout the world as a movement, including having passed in 12 cities in the United States, and with legislation pending or being heard in at least 4 states. My ancestry is from Mexico, and particularly indigenous ancestry in Jalisco. My family is also from Chihuahua, Mexico, and the El Paso border region. We came to the United States as immigrants in the early 1900s. And with that came all of the traumas that the immigrant communities face in the United States, including poverty, including a struggle. We come from farm workers in the US. And my life was, early life was one of deep struggle. At a recent family gathering where all of our cousins showed up, a very large family. It was noted that almost half of our cousins were absent from there, many of whom died young, are incarcerated due to the war on drugs, or simply fell off the map. This is the struggle of our inner cities, which I hope to share with you. That's my perspective today. However, I held deep hope in my life, and as such, I followed my path to receive my bachelor's degree in biology and a master's degree in environmental science from Yale. I then became a political activist and organized here in Oakland. I got to know the inner city very much and understood the impacts of the war on drugs and incarceration on our inner cities. It wasn't, though, for me until a mushroom journey in October of 2018 that I really understood the power of these plant medicines and began to understand not just the healing effects of these plant medicines, but also the history of them. And what I came to learn was that these plant medicines have been used throughout the world for over 3,000 years and closer probably to 10,000 years, starting in Northern Africa, throughout Europe, the Americas, Asia, in various forms, including ayahuasca, peyote, mescaline-containing cacti, mushrooms. And as I dug deeper, I began to learn that in my own country, the highest concentration of entheogenic use in Mexico is known to have occurred, including the Toltecs using mushrooms, the Mazatec using mushrooms, the Mayans, Aztecs, Tarascans using ayahuasca, the Wixárika using peyote, many of them using huachuma. And however, these plant medicine use, which was used ubiquitously in ceremony with all community members, not just specific members and not just by shaman, but all members of the community, were suppressed soon after colonization occurred. And then without any proof, any science as to any dangers of the plant medicines, they were then further made illegal in the war on drugs by Nixon. And that led to the incarceration of many people, now with the United States having over 2.2 million people in prisons, 4 times the amount of people of the next first world country. Dr. Sean Gendrite out of San Francisco State University has coined the phrase persistent traumatic stress exposure. This phrase is used to describe the conditions in marginalized communities throughout the United States. It explains the impact of chronic exposure to stressors, including poverty, insecurity, lack of safety, lack of access to resources, lack of access to educational opportunities, job opportunities, and the day-to-day stressors of living in marginalized communities. What we know is that when we set limits on anything in our country, particularly having to do with drugs, or in this case with entheogens, those who end up facing incarceration are the most marginalized in our society. So it was soon after this experience in October of 2018 that I realized the power of these medicines and wished they had been accessible to my own family members who'd struggled with all of the traumas of inner cities of America. I then looked for community and found a very wonderful community here in the Bay Area that was working with these plant medicines underground, many of them learning from lineages throughout, indigenous lineages throughout Mexico, throughout the United States and the world. And we created the Decriminalize Nature movement. And the intention of the movement was to always come from a place of compassion to serve the most vulnerable in our society. So all policies that we make from the perspective of how can these remain accessible to the most marginalized. We're strong supporters of community-based education and community-based ceremony. These continue to be the most accessible to those without sufficient resources to experience therapy, medical, or other models of healing. We see an ecosystem within our communities where community-based ceremony can coexist with therapeutic models and with medical models. However, our role, we understand, is to really protect the most vulnerable models, which are the grow, gather, gift model, which is people being able to grow their own, share their own, but also community-based ceremony for people to be able to experience this with trained healers in community. And so that's what we advocate for. And we hope we can get your support for decriminalizing these entheogens without limits to ensure that the most marginalized people of America can find their healing path without fear of incarceration. Thank you. With that, I'd like to turn it over to one of the co-founders of Decriminalize Nature, Larry Norris.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Carlos. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning. I'd like to start off by offering my deep gratitude to both Senator Hashmi and Delegate Adams for this incredible conference, amazing speakers, and for the courageous leadership they have to introduce this upcoming legislation, decriminalize entheogenic plants and fungi. Thank you to all who have presented today and organized this conference, and to the Virginia legislators who are here to learn more about the potentials of plant mushroom medicines. My name is Dr. Larry Norris. I'm the co-founder of Entheogenic Research, Integration, and Education, a 501c3 nonprofit, which for the last decade has offered education and integration support to those interested in sacred plant and mushroom experiences. I'm also the co-founder of Decriminalize Nature National with Carlos Bozola, who just spoke. Decriminalize Nature is a 501c4 organization which aims to decriminalize sacred plant and fungi medicines in cities and states across the US. The mission of Decriminalize Nature is to improve human health and well-being by decriminalizing and expanding access to entheogenic plants and fungi through political and community organizing, education, and advocacy. Entheogenic plants and fungi are medicines that have been utilized by cultures across the world for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. These include mushrooms containing psilocybin, cacti containing mescaline, plant combinations like ayahuasca, and plant containing ibogaine. These are natural plants and fungi that grow from the ground and have been an integral part of healing for ages. But due to the Controlled Substances Act, these healing modalities were stripped away from the people, not based on any scientific evidence, but rather politics and misunderstanding. The Decriminalize Nature movement is a people's movement that encouraged participation and collaboration with our elected officials and local government. We seek to build alliances with our elected officials to safeguard our community's needs. Let's work together to find new ways to heal our community. The movement to decriminalize these plant and fungi medicines has grown quickly over the last 2.5 years since passing in Oakland in 2019. As Carlos mentioned, now 12 cities in one county have passed similar policy across the US, including Oakland, Santa Cruz, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Washtenaw County, Michigan, Washington, DC, Somerville, Cambridge, Northampton, and East Hampton, Massachusetts, Seattle, Washington, Arcata, California, and Detroit, Michigan. And there are active communities in over 40 cities that are currently engaging with their elected officials to propose decriminalize nature policy on the local or state level and build support and infrastructure for entheogens and community. Most of the city councils who voted to decriminalize these plant and fungi medicines have done so unanimously, and the community support is there as well. With Washington, DC ballot initiative winning in November 2020 with 76% voter approval, which is pretty impressive. In Detroit, Michigan, with a 61% voter approval in November of 2021. People are ready to take the steps to decriminalize plant and fungi medicines. In the 12 cities that have passed so far, there have been no reports of emergencies or increases in crimes related to entheogens. Reports from communities across the US suggest that decriminalization is allowing for access to people, including all people, including marginalized communities, to find healing that has not been possible through traditional treatments. It is important to note that entheogens are not recreational substances. These are healing plants and most often done in an intentional manner for mental and psychological health and personal and spiritual growth. Decriminalization is not legalization with complex regulatory frameworks and time or resources needed from the Virginia legislator. We are simply asking for compassion. Let's remove the penalties for the natural plant and fungi and allow people to have access to healing that can truly benefit our communities like they have been doing for thousands of years. While working with my nonprofit Entheogenic Research, Integration, and Education for the last decade, I've seen remarkable changes in individuals in their healing process. People that were at their ends and finally found a way out through their mental health conditions. Some may wonder about the potential risks of these medicines, as we mentioned earlier. And when we talk about public and personal safety, it is important to note relative risks. Some of the substances we know that have a high risk for public safety are already legal, including alcohol, tobacco, pharmaceuticals. There are no laws against eating as many poisonous mushrooms as one wants. Even taking selfies have a higher rate of injury than all of the entheogens combined. On the other hand, as mentioned earlier today, natural materials such as mushrooms containing psilocybin are considered by many studies to be some of the safest. And while there is always risk for anything, when these plants and fungi can help with suicidality, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and personal and spiritual growth, isn't it worth decriminalizing these natural plant and fungi medicines to help heal our community? The question we must ask ourselves is, how is arresting people for healing with sacred plant and fungi medicines increasing the public safety of our community? There's no research to show punitive approaches towards these plant and fungi medicines have worked. In fact, it only increases the risk since resources and support systems are unavailable. On the other hand, we know from many cities, reports in many cities that have passed decriminalization policy that support the current scientific research, that these plant and fungi medicines can be effective for addressing a multitude of mental health issues, especially those emerging from the COVID pandemic, such as depression and anxiety. While it's exciting to hear about the clinical and medical approaches, these settings often have a high cost, sometimes costing thousands of dollars for treatment to access material naturally occurring in mushrooms and plants that for next to nothing. Also, the FDA trials will take many years before they are available for administration. Yet we know from historical evidence and reports of healing that these plant and fungi medicines can work now and have been working for many tens of thousands, if not thousands of individuals. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of individuals, we should say. Basic human rights must include personal sovereignty, the capability to choose our own human experience. Adults are not children, and with proper education can be empowered to make their own decisions, a potent first step toward healing. We see decriminalization as a risk reduction strategy. Those that are already having experiences can feel safe to find the support they may need. Those who are new to entheogens will be able to educate themselves within the community on safe and responsible practices. As more and more scientific research and media talk about the benefit of entheogens, people will naturally want to see what this is all about. Rather than perpetuate a system which causes fear and anxiety about being arrested for healing oneself, perhaps it is time to try another approach. One that honors the self-agency and sovereignty of adults and the unalienable right to have their own relationship with nature. We look forward to continuing to work with you and are available for any questions you may have about the Decriminalize Nature movement or the potential benefits of these sacred medicines. We are lucky to have one of the many incredible leaders of the Decriminalize Nature movement living here in Richmond, Virginia, who for over the last year and beyond has been working hard to educate the community about the healing potential of these plants and fungi and to reduce the stigma associated with over 50 years of misinformation. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our next speaker of the conference, Will Nelson, the co-founder of Decriminalize Nature Virginia and founder and lead organizer of Decriminalize Nature Richmond, Virginia. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you to everyone attending today. All the attendees, I want to give a shout out to my Richmond team. I want to give a shout out to the Fairfax Psychedelic Society, the Chesapeake Psychedelic Society, everyone across Virginia who's reached out to us in the last couple of years. Thank you for Mark for helping me put this together. We've been a powerful team. In the midst of everything that's going on, pushing this forward. Thank you to Senator Hashmi and Delegate Donna Adams for just initially just listening to our stories and taking it to heart and taking it into consideration. What brought me into this initiative to decriminalize nature, to looking into these plants, was initially the loss of my mother. I lost my mother in March 2018 to multiple myeloma. It's cancer of blood plasma cells. It was a slow decline, 5-year struggle. That's when my life kind of turned upside down, to put it lightly. It's when I lost my support financially, emotionally. She was my rock. I struggled with very severe depression after that. I struggled with anxiety and trauma from dealing with, a house going into foreclosure, a variety of things that come after losing a parent. I dropped out of college. I was a senior at BCU studying psychology. I wanted to be an art therapist when I grew up. But I had to quit school to work and be able to sustain myself. And I'd say 2019 is when things really changed for me. I started really investigating the research that was going on from Johns Hopkins. We heard from Matthew Johnson earlier, Imperial College London, all these big names. And then I was really excited to see that right here at VCU in Richmond, where I've been for the last 10 years, that research into this was also going on. I'm Virginia, born and raised. I've never lived anywhere else. Born in Culpeper, Virginia. Been in Richmond for a little over 10 years. What inspired me to start Decriminalize Nature was first of all, hearing what was going on in other places, hearing about people's anecdotal reports about finding healing from traumas, childhood traumas, family issues, substance use issues that go through family trees and intergenerational trauma, how these things kind of work their way down the family trees. And I sought out traditional counseling in and out of therapy for the last 8 years. I've been on antidepressants before, but I always found myself coming back to the same problems, the same issues, the same blockages. As we all currently know, in Virginia, there is nowhere to legally or safely do this without risk of prosecution. Ketamine, off-label use ketamine therapy is legal. And so I thought that was my last resort option. Well, the issue with that is, A, it's not covered by insurance. B, the price to do that out of pocket is $400, $500, $800 a session. And as someone who's at the time was struggling just to make ends meet, that was not an option. And in my worst of times, even therapy was not an option, because as I lost my parents' healthcare plan, just seeing a therapist or seeing a psychiatrist for medication management or what have you was an expense that I couldn't even afford at the time. That's when I started looking at the plants. I'd done some experimentation in college, like many folks do, forgotten about it, and I ended up coming full circle back to it. And that's part of our perspective coming into this, is that accessibility is as important as what these medicines and plants can do. If you can't access it, if people who are from lower income, if people who don't have resources to obtain these things with can't get it, then we're not serving the maximum benefit to Richmond, to Virginia, to society, or the world. Something that I relate this to that might make it a little more real for folks, look at food insecurity, look at what's going on around community gardening, urban gardening. People being able to grow their own is so important. And we see that now in the midst of this pandemic and the supply chain issues that we hear about, the empty grocery store shelves that we had in 2020. It is so important for people being able to take ownership, not only of their own food, but of their own medicine or their own healing. That is so empowering. We can all learn how to grow tomatoes in our garden. We can all learn how to grow the mint in our bedroom windowsill. And I want to illustrate that these are plants and mushrooms. These aren't some scary, terrifying thing made in the lab or this really sketchy thing going on in alleyways or something. For an example, this is a San Pedro cactus. This is legal to buy, sell, trade all the way across the United States of America. It is not controlled for ornamental purposes. The second that I slice this up and drop it into a cup of hot water, I can be charged with felony manufacturing of a Schedule I substance. The same is true for all of the plants and combinations that make up ayahuasca. that has plenty of research and has been talked about before in the same talk. That juxtaposition is exactly what motivated me to start moving this initiative forward. We're not asking for money. We aren't asking for handouts. We're not asking for anything out of the way. We're just asking the cities, the states, the officials to allow people to seek out their own healing and allowing people to enjoy that healing in community together. Because as we've heard, the integration component of this is very important, and having that community afterwards that you can follow up with and share your experiences with is also very, very important. That's what's giving me a sense of hope, is being able to spread this information to other folks, hearing from people from Floyd, Virginia, Lynchburg, Virginia, Fredericksburg, Virginia, Culpeper, Virginia, Northern Virginia. The messages I get of people so excited that this is even being talked about in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We became the first state to legalize cannabis in the South. I never thought we'd see that day. I'm here asking you, the legislators, the city council members, and to be honest with you, even our federal representatives, to look into this, to take this seriously. Decriminalization is an easy path for us to take to start addressing all of these major life-destroying issues that we're facing in 2021, coming out of this pandemic or still being in this pandemic and the stress that occurs, the racial trauma that I personally can speak to that's going on in Virginia with our history. The reason we set the conference this way is to show you that this isn't just a left or a right policy. This isn't just a Black or a white policy. This isn't a poor versus rich policy. This is something that benefits everyone, because human suffering, trauma, depression, anxiety, and even addiction touches all of our lives in one way or another. And what we're asking is for the legislators to consider not prosecuting, not creating an area of fear around healing, and allowing folks to grow their own, share, and have these experiences in community. We're not asking for sales. Buying and selling is nowhere in our mission, because ultimately the purpose is access so that we can heal as individuals, as community, as cities, as a state, and as a nation. I encourage folks, whatever cities you're in, my attendees, to approach your city councils, talk to your delegates, talk to your representatives, because they will listen. They will listen. These are issues they want to address. I'm amazed that I'm here speaking today. Politics is not something I ever wanted to get into. Activism wasn't anything I'd ever dreamed of being or doing. I felt compelled because I had found healing, and I know there's so many other folks out there suffering. And on that note, I will turn it back over. Thank you so much for hearing us out today.
So thank you, Will, for being on this journey with you. Being on this journey with you has been an honor as we pulled this together, this conference. I want to extend so much thank yous to everyone who presented this morning, certainly to Delegate Adams and Senator Hashmi for their advocacy and for their putting forward the legislation. I want to really put out to the delegates and senators that when you see this legislation, that you are able to consider it. And I also suggest that you too submit what you feel makes sense for the on how we can move forward in the Commonwealth. With that idea in mind, I see that Delegate Adams and Senator Hashmi are on. So I'm going to turn it over to Delegate Adams first, and then I'm going to ask Senator Hashmi to kind of close this out.
Thanks, Mark. And again, thank you to all the participants, the speakers, as well as the people who attended. I do want to share, and I think this is important. So obviously, Senator Hashmi and myself are Democrats. She's the Senate, I'm in the House. And I want you to know that there were participants from both Republicans and Democrats listening. I personally received text messages from several Republicans stating how interesting this was and how helpful it was. And that is really encouraging and exciting that we have people both interested, but also see the value. So again, I'm very grateful for all of the presenters, people who shared their personal stories. I think we can all relate to them in one fashion or another. And it's just so meaningful when we see the effects of policy on day-to-day life and the potential to change people's lives for the better. So thank you again. And Senator Hashmi, appreciate you putting this together and your staff working with mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Delegate Adams, and really appreciate the good work that your office has also done in coordinating. And I think we've gotten a real sense of the level of coordination that it's taken to bring so many different experts and professionals together on a busy weekday morning. But what a conference this has been. I've learned so much. And the insights that have been shared today really highlight the ways in which these medicines have the potential to dramatically impact lives of individuals and in our entire community. So thank you to everybody who's presented. And like Delegate Adams, I too have received some messages from our fellow legislators who've been listening, who really appreciate it. You know, a lot of times we tackle on policy issues and try to educate ourselves as best as we can, but we are not experts, and we certainly heard from subject matter experts this morning, and that's made a tremendous difference to understand the scope and potential of what we are looking at today. I want to thank Mark again for the organization and efforts he's put in, really appreciate it. And as we close out, I've gotten a request that everyone turn on their videos if they're able to, so we can get a group picture. It's a picture day here for the class, and we would love to get a shot before we head out this evening. Thank you to everyone who's participated, and please feel free to send any questions, any additional questions you have to any of us, and we will be happy to get back. So if everybody is on, I think Charles is going to take a group shot. Charles, are we done?
Sorry, I'm working on it. I wasn't planning for doing this. So, all right, 1 sec. All right, we are good.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your